volunteered for the Atlanta Summer Games. Mike Strauss is currently the director of the Clinical Athletic Training Residency Program, as well as the team physician assistant for MSU's field hockey and Lansing Lugnuts. Tonight, we have the privilege of having two distinguished speakers. Jackie Hyman completed her Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science and Sociology at Drake University and her Master's in Arts in Student Affairs Administration at Michigan State University. She's currently completing her certificate in disability studies at the City University of New York. Jackie is currently the education program coordinator at Michigan State University for the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives. She's the coordinator for MSU Dialogue, Sustained Intergroup Dialogue Program, which annually engages 200 plus Michigan State University students, faculty, and staff in the semester-long program, exploring social identities, power, privilege, oppression, and other social justice-related topics, as well as taking action to work towards social justice. Dr. Renee Shingles is from the Dr. Renee Shingles is currently working at Central Michigan University. She completed her Bachelor's of Arts at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and her Master's of Science in Athletic Training at Illinois State University. She also completed her PhD at Michigan State University in kinesiology. Dr. Shingles is a professor and the internship coordinator, and she was the program director for athletic training for the past 15 years at Central Michigan University. Dr. Shingles has worked the Atlanta Olympic Games in 1996, as well as the World University Games. She also has numerous publications, including a book titled Cultural Competence in Sports Medicine. Dr. Shingles was awarded the Great Lakes Athletic Trainers Association Dedicated Service Award, the Great Lakes Athletic Trainers Association Outstanding Educators Award, the National Athletic Trainers Association Most Distinguished Athletic Trainer, and in 2018, Dr. Renee Shingles was the first African-American woman inducted into the National Athletic Trainers Hall of Fame. Before I turn it over to our two speakers, just a couple of notes. If you have questions and answers, please put those in the question and answer in the link, as well as we're going to hold the questions till the end, and then I will be asking those questions to our two speakers. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Renee Shingles and Jackie.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for hanging out with us. We appreciate your taking time out of your busy days to talk with us about cultural competence in sports medicine. We're really looking forward to our conversation tonight, and we're going to get started. I want to tell you a little bit about our presenter conflicts that we need to share with you. As was indicated, I am a co-author of Cultural Competence in Sports Medicine. The statements that I will be giving today, some of them may come from the textbook, as well as my own research and my own literature review. There's no conflict. Where there are no conflicts, those views are my own, except we're cited appropriately either from my textbook or from other areas. And participants must use discretion when using information contained in this presentation.
Hello, everyone. So as for me, the conflicts, that I am the coordinator of the MSU Dialogues program. The statements and opinions contained in this program are solely mine, except where appropriately cited. And to the cultural competence information presented today is also solely based on the MSU Dialogues program, as well as our associated materials. And that there is no conflict in terms of the views expressed today in the slides in today's discussion are mine, except where properly cited. And to that participants must use discretion when using information contained in this presentation.
So before we get started, I'd like to do what I call grounding, and this hopefully puts us in the frame of mind as we begin to participate in this presentation. So I'd like for you to take a moment and silence your phones, try to remove any distractions, and if you're able, put your feet on the ground or get into a comfortable position, close your eyes and cast your gaze at a neutral site, and take a deep breath. Focus your attention on this space. Be here. Be present in this moment. And when you're ready, open your eyes and let's focus. As we get started, it's important, I want you to, you may need a piece of paper and a pencil or something to write with. We have an activity where we're going to have you to write something. So if you don't have that, make sure you have it. So for the prelude here, I feel like I've been asleep my whole life. I didn't realize who I was, what I believed, where I was going. But I now know what I value about myself and my profession and what I need to do to practice from a culturally sensitive and competent perspective. This was done or said by athletic training students who were taking a cultural competency class, where after that, they really felt like they understood what was going on. They finally better understood themselves and their profession and how to practice from a culturally sensitive perspective. So I hope that after this presentation, you'll begin to feel a little more towards that. And so the purpose of this presentation is to introduce cultural competence. We're going to define some concepts related to identity and privilege and power. We're going to help you to unpack the fanny pack with some experiences and some activities. And so we all know about the fanny pack, so we all have had one. So we're going to unpack it a little bit. And then we're going to use some tools designed to help facilitate communication. So we're going to give you some tools that hopefully you can use that will help you to communicate across difference. So we invite you to engage, be respectful. We're not looking for any right or wrong answers, just your thoughts, just your experiences. You also have the right to keep your thoughts and your comments private if you decide you don't want to share something. But one of the things that's important to remember is intent versus impact. Sometimes the things that we say in these types of forums may have an impact negatively on someone, and we may not always know it. As I like to say, you sometimes open mouth and insert foot. And if that happens, understand that there could be a negative impact for someone, but I hope for that individual, they understand that there was no intent, no malintent here. We're all trying to learn and trying to grow. Speak for yourself using I statements, own what you say, as opposed to speaking for other groups. We don't want you to feel like you should be speaking for any other group, just speaking for yourself. Suspend disbelief. If someone asks a question in the chat later and we talk about something and you want to go, really? Did that really happen? Suspend disbelief. If someone says it happened, believe them. Believe that it did. It's their experience, though it may not be an experience you would have had or that would be familiar to you. Have fun. We want to have a good time as we go through this presentation. And then kind of the sort of Vegas rule, but what happens here stays here, but what's learned here leaves here. So the things that you might learn and you go back and talk with your colleagues, don't out people and individuals with regard to what you may have learned here today, but do take what you've learned and share that. So enjoy.
Okay, so now to build off of that, also invite you today to really lean into a little bit of this learning edge or brave space. And so the model that you see up on your screen, on the inside is the comfort zone. And that's where we are when we are just hanging out, doing what we do on a day-to-day basis, but not challenging ourselves to go outside of what might be our norm. Now, the learning edge and brave space is where we really challenge all of us to be leaning into today. That's where we are being open-minded. We're learning about new ideas and new perspectives. We're being introspective and thinking too about our own experiences and our own identities, and really challenging ourselves to broaden our horizon, broaden our perspective and our view of the world. And on the outside too is this buttons push space, which to this buttons push space can be a place where especially if you are really, really challenged. So for example, say you have a minoritized identity or multiple minoritized identities, and someone says something that is really harmful to you, then that might put you in that buttons pushed place. Or two, if you're learning about a new concept. So for example, I'm white, and I know for a lot of fellow white folks that when we're leaning into conversations about race, that because we do not talk about race enough, that might put us in a place where like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I have to talk about race right now. This is really, really stressful. And so that also might make us retreat back into that comfort zone. And what we really challenge you to do today is to continuously try to push yourself into that learning edge space. So whether it's you need to ground yourself, put your feet on the ground, if you need to take a couple of deep breaths just to get yourself back into that brave space, into that learning edge space where you really are able to fully engage. So try to keep that in mind too as we progress throughout the conversation today, and also outside of our time, really challenge yourself to push yourself into that brave space more often, so you can really be learning and growing in partnership with the folks around you.
So what is cultural competence? A process in which you become involved in and appreciate cultural differences. And even more than appreciating, really embracing cultural differences, being culturally sensitive, culturally appropriate, meeting the needs of a given person, family, or community. The issues that you might see in your patient may be beyond just your patient. If you're working with a high schooler and that person has obesity issues, some of those issues may be about the family. Maybe the family has issues with regard to their weight and weight management. And is it a community issue? And so I like this definition because it talks about not just the person, but also the family and the community and how those link together. Other aspects of cultural competence include cultural awareness, and that's learning about yourself. Who am I? What do I think? What do I believe? What are my issues? What are my prejudices? What are my biases? And so we're going to do a little bit of that tonight. Cultural knowledge, that's learning about others. Who are the people that you are treating? Who are your patients? And how do you learn about who they are and what their needs are so that you can treat them from their particular perspective? Cultural skill, this is putting things into practice. And so we're going to give you a couple of tools that you can use as a part of cultural skill. Cultural encounters, this is when you get to work with other individuals. And the more you can work across those differences and learn more about people, which helps to break down some of the stereotypes. Right now, we need to do that as a part of masking up and 6 feet apart, but nonetheless, having those cultural encounters. Cultural desire is wanting to rather than having to. So you want to become more culturally competent as opposed to having to, because a part of how you're going to be evaluated for your job is how well you are being involved with cultural competency or cultural diversity or inclusion. And so this is the wanting to rather than the having to. And then something that's being talked about more recently is cultural humility. And so how do we have openness? How do we have egolessness, being less ego-centered? How do we incorporate self-reflection and self-critique and achieving equity for all? So this is a little bit more about the cultural humility. We want equity for all people. So those are some of the aspects of cultural competence, particularly as it relates to the work of Kapina Bakote. So why is this important? Several things. There's changes that are happening in the US demographics. We're going to talk about some of these changes. 20% of the population speaks a language other than English, and in the United States, that language is more likely Spanish than any other. Though depending upon the community that you're in, there may be larger numbers. Here in Michigan, in Dearborn, Michigan, we have the largest percentage of people outside of the Middle East live in Dearborn, Michigan. So Arabic is very common in that city and across those schools and the whole system. You'll find lots of people who speak and write Arabic. Diverse populations should be ensured equal access to services. Again, here in Michigan, the community north of us has one of the highest populations of individuals who are in poverty. And so they should have equal access, no different than here near the university. Respect for and understanding of cultural differences are critical in the practitioner-client relationship, and it's necessary for building trust. So I'm going to share with you a couple of different types of statistics as well. We have an increase, or will be having an increase in what's called majority minority states. Not my words, these are from the US government. I would call it something different, but this is what they choose to use. And so currently, where we have more people of color, or there's a new term some of you may have heard, BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color, are in greater percentage of the population than whites. And currently that's in California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Nevada, Texas. but by 2060, that's going to jump to 22 states. And if you look by 2040, you'll see there will also be a jump in that. And so 2040 is just 20 years from now. So some of you who are young professionals, and I understand there may be some high school students who are viewing this, you're going to see this change as you progress in your careers and into your futures. We also see a change in people who are educated. Right now, as of 2010, 71% of whites have a bachelor's degree, and then we see 12% Black, 6% Hispanic, 0.6% Hispanic, 6% Hispanic, 2% Asian, and 1% is other. But by 2045, it's going to go down to 50% white, 25% Hispanic, 13% Black, 4% Asian, and 0.9 multiracial, multi-ethnic. So we're going to see a little bit of shift of who's acquiring bachelor's degrees. Millennials are I can't say that today. Millennials are projected to overtake the baby boomers. I happen to be a baby boomer, and I've got other folk that I know in my family who are the millennials. But if you look at the top part of that graph, you'll notice that right now, those groups are similar in numbers, but as we move out to 2050, the baby boomers, we're going to continue to die off, and the millennials are going to continue to rise. So it's going to be important in being able to understand how to communicate across the different generational groups and what the millennials like to do versus what Gen X likes to do versus baby boomers. And so this is another reason to become culturally competent, to understand the different groups that you may come across. Something else that is going to continue to change, we're going to see more women entering into the workforce as we push towards 2024, and fewer men in the overall labor force. So you're going to see a gender difference, at least as it relates to men, women. I do understand that this is a dichotomy, but this is how the data was collected. So, so understand that if we think about individuals who identify in other ways, unfortunately, we don't have that particular type of data, but in terms of the dichotomy of men, women, this is where you're going to see some changes and projections over the next several years.
Okay, so now shifting into talking about social identities, all the different identities that make up who we are. And so to start out with a definition of a social group, that they are people who share a range of physical, cultural, and social characteristics with one of the social identity categories. And so some of these identities might include gender, ability, race, age, ethnicity, sexual and romantic identity, social class, language, citizenship. But to note that these are only some of the identities. By no means are we saying that this is an all-encompassing list. So as we're going through today, there will be some identities that you'll see that we'll really talk about, and in no way do we mean to be exclusive. So in no way are we trying to dismiss a part of your identity if we don't include that. But to just keep that in mind as we're going through our presentation today. And so some groups have different statuses, and due to the different statuses, that some folks will have greater access to power and to privilege based on their membership in their social group. So for example, due to gender privilege, cisgender men earn more money than cisgender women for doing the exact same job. And two, that is then exacerbated as well when you factor race into it. And so see that especially white men make far, far more than Black women, than Indigenous women. An additional example is as a result of accumulated inequity and discrimination, that white families have 10 times more wealth accumulated than Black families. So just two examples of ways that social group membership also plays out related to power and privilege. Also too worth noting that everyone belongs to multiple different social groups and has different statuses as well, depending on which social group that they belong in.
And let me add something to that, Jackie. And so not just along with your social group status, but it's also perceived group status that can determine how you are treated. So if someone perceives you to be in a certain group, they may treat you a certain way based on how they perceive that. So I often say to my students sometimes, imagine that you're going to go home for the holiday and have dinner around the table. And you may be an individual who is cisgender or you are heterosexual, and you know this, so you're going to try this experiment. So when you're at home and you're having dinner with the family and grandma's there and papa's there and auntie and uncle are sitting around the table, and all of a sudden you announce, guess what? Really, I'm not. I'm actually, I'm trans and I don't feel like I fit in the body that I'm in. And so for some of you, grandpa's going to fall over, grandma's going to have heart palpitations, and, your brother's going to look at you and say, pass the peas, and everything's going to be fine. And so it's how they might perceive you. All of a sudden they perceived you under one group status, and then the next thing you're telling them something different. So they may treat you differently, and others may be fine with that. So sometimes perceived group status can also have an impact on you as well.
Definitely. Thank you for adding that in, Renee.
Mhm.
So now getting into privilege a little bit. So the definition of privilege, we're going to give you a couple different definitions to work from and to be thinking about. So the first one is a special unearned right or advantage available only to a specific group of people based on social group membership. And a few important notes to associated with that is that most everyone has privilege in some way, shape, or form. To my understanding, a lot of the folks in on this call have either they've finished high school, which is to a privilege in itself, getting your associate's degree, your bachelor's degree, your master's degree, your PhD, all of those. Education status is a massive privilege. Having US citizenship, if folks on here do have their US citizenship, that's a huge privilege. And so in some way, shape, or form, I would think that most folks on this call have access to some sort of privilege. And to that privilege it's not about shame or guilt. It's not about making you feel bad at all, but it's about challenging the institutions that perpetuate inequity. And so it's not saying you are a bad person. Please do not think that. That all is one, recognizing and acknowledging that there are certain unearned benefits and unearned rights that you have, as well as to looking at challenging those institutions that perpetuate the reasons why you have those unearned benefits. And also, to privilege doesn't mean that you haven't had struggles or challenges. So for example, I'm disabled, and the fact that I'm white and I hold white privilege does in no way cancel out the challenges that I've had due to my disabled identity. All it does is say that because I am white, that there are certain things that have been made easier for me. So another way to think about privilege, which was explained by Liz Kleinrock, is how are you set up to thrive based on your identity? And so thinking about the ways in which that systems and structures are set up. So now again, if we're thinking about maybe my disabled identity, for example, that when I'm a student, right, right now I'm in classes, and that my classes are set up to thrive for able-bodied students, that they're not set up to thrive for disabled students to be able to thrive in. To this same concept can be applied to a range of different identities and situations. There's just one additional way for you to try to conceptualize and think about privilege a little bit more this evening.
So we're going to move a little bit into cultural awareness and begin to, as I've mentioned it, unpack the fanny pack with regard to social identity. And so this idea of unpacking our fanny pack goes beyond just our individual identities. We all have identities that emerge within a particular context and are socially defined. And so it's important to understand that in society helps to define those identities. You may identify a certain kind of way, but as I've indicated earlier, how you're perceived in society. So I hope you will join us in exploring social identity with this exercise that we're going to do.
Okay, so before we dive into explaining the specific exercise, that we first want to present this chart to you. And so once again, in no way is this a definitive list of identities. There are just some examples. And two, we're going to be using a pull function in a little bit. And the poll function is limited to only 10 options. And so we had to just choose 10 identities to include on here. So typically neither Renee or I would combine race or ethnicity, recognizing that they are both different identities. Well, there might be some overlap for some folks, that they are also so different. So we had to combine some, and we had to shorten our list a little bit. I think initially we maybe had 14 different identities that we wanted to include. So just wanted to put that out there as well as a caveat. And so too, as you're looking at this list, you might notice some different identities that aren't familiar to you. You haven't really heard of them before. And if you're noticing some that aren't familiar to you, I challenge you to jot those down. And after our workshop today, go and do some research, learn a little bit more about these identities. I think as a collective, as a society, we can all do a little bit of a better job of just like really digging in and doing some research when we come across an identity that we don't know about. So for example, typically get questions about a demisexual as a sexual and romantic identity. If that one applies to you as a word that you're not familiar with, I challenge you to do some research afterwards. And to this chart, we'll be coming back, so don't worry if you haven't gotten a chance to read through it all yet. So we also too want to give some examples as well on pronouns. And that while folks have been using pronouns that aren't associated with the gender binary for a long time, that it's kind of become a little bit in broader knowledge as of lately. So we did want to spend just a little bit of time digging into some different pronouns. So first off, there's she, her, and hers, he, him, and his, they, them, theirs. They, them, theirs is one that folks might use if they are gender nonconforming or gender non-binary, agender, and also sie, them, zir, or sie, here, and heres are neopronouns. And if you want to learn more too about neopronouns or just about pronouns in general, the link there is a great resource, as well as too, there's lots of other resources as well. Yeah, Renee, did you want to add something?
Yep, I do. One of the things that I know that I've done with my paperwork, and maybe some of you have done this as well, in your intake papers, when people are coming in to see you, or your pre-participation physical examinations, you can put a place on there asking two things. One, how do people want to be addressed, so that the person who comes in who looks like Michelle, but whose legal name is Michael, because it hasn't been changed yet, that you know how that person wants to be identified with regard to their name, but also what is their pronoun of choice? How do they want to be identified, so that you have that information in some cases before you even have the encounter? Because if you work in a place where people fill out the paperwork and they send it back to you, or it's in the electronic medical record before they actually see you, you'll have an idea of how individuals want to be identified. So that's something to keep in mind, and something that you can use now, and take a look at the paperwork that you're using and how you are asking people to identify themselves, so that you can identify them in ways in which they would like to be identified.
That's a great point. And so one last concept that we want to talk about before we jump into our activity is the concept of intersectionality, which is a term coined, there we go, I apologize, words are difficult, a coined term by Kimberly Crenshaw. And what it is it's looking at where power comes from, collides, where it interlocks, and where it intersects. In a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, it says, many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are oftentimes overlapping, creating multiple levels of social justice. And so where Crenshaw really came up with this term was when she was looking at some of the policies that were for places of employment, that there were policies that protected women in the workplace, specifically white women in the workplace, and there were policies that protected Black men within the workplace, but there weren't any policies that protected Black women in the workplace. So she realized that there was this distinct intersection, which is where intersectionality came from, of the ways in which that Black women experience the world, whether it be in the legal system or to just socially. And so now it's kind of broadened out a little bit too, to look at any of the different ways that folks' minoritized identities create a unique experience based on the combination of those two identities. And so to an additional example, that sometimes folks too will just say that any two identities the ways in which those two identities interact with each other is an example of intersectionality, but that it's specifically focused on two minoritized identities. So for example, the fact that I'm a white woman, that would not be an example of intersectionality. However, the fact that I'm a Jewish disabled woman, cisgender woman, would be an example of intersectionality. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our activity. And so if you do not have a piece of paper and pen nearby, I encourage you to get up and get one if you do have it. And so for this activity, we're going to be creating an identity pie chart, which is really going to be looking at the amount that we think about each identity, the amount that it might influence our day-to-day actions, the way that we move through the world. And an example too of what this will look like for me, this is my identity pie chart, is that you'll see, for example, that ability is really big, that my disabilities impact every single decision that I make throughout the day. It impacts when I can get my work done, how I have to get my work done. It impacts the way that I organize my life. It impacts so many decisions throughout my day. And so ability for me is going to be really big. And then also gender identity, being a cisgender woman, that I also think about being a woman pretty frequently. However, sex assigned at birth, because my sex aligns with my gender identity, that I do not think about my sex very often. And so that for me is going to be a lot smaller piece of the pie, as well as to body size, that I'm straight sized, which means that I'm able to find clothes in almost every single store I go to. It's not a challenge for me to find clothes. It's not a challenge for me to find a chair to sit in when I go to class. It's not a challenge for me to sit comfortably on an airplane. And now I'm going to show Renee's and pass it over to her for her to talk through what hers looks like as well.
And as you can see for mine, my two bigger areas, race and ethnicity, come to mind for me. I am a Black woman, if you wanted to talk ethnicity, African-American woman, and those two things impact what I do. They impact how I'm seen, and people see that, or at least presume that I am a woman. Sex assigned at birth kind of goes hand in hand with me, with my gender identity, since I am cisgender. My sex assigned at birth and my gender identity align. They align in a way that I dress and present myself as well. And so those things have a large impact about the things that I do. Some other things, my age as I have gotten older, I'll now hear things when I go to the doctor. Well, you know, you're getting older. I think I want to say something really interesting to the next healthcare professional who says that to me. But they start off with the, because you know you're getting older, and then I get the AARP information that comes to me. And so age has increased a little bit more for me these days. I happen to be Catholic and a person of faith, and so that informs a lot of what I do and how I go about my day. That's important. Smaller things, my immigration status, I am in the US and from the US, so I don't really think about immigration at all. Again, I would be considered straight sized as well, so I don't often think about my body size. I'm able to do pretty much the things that I would like to do. Things are made for smaller people, though not shorter people. So sometimes there are things sitting in the airplane. Yes, the seat might be a size that I can sit in, but my feet might be dangling. So every now and then my height is more of an issue for me. As a person who is married, it's not something, because a heterosexual relationship is considered the norm. It's not something I think about, because my type of relationship with my partner is considered normative in this country. And so it's not something that I think a lot about. So that tells you a little bit about why my pie chart looks the way that it does.
And now here too are our pie charts just side by side, so you can see that just based on our own unique identities and the ways that they influence the way that we move through the world, that our pie charts look very, very different from each other's. And your pie chart too will look very, very, very different from ours, most likely. And so now we're going to...
Can you hold on for just a quick minute?
Yeah.
There was a comment, you know, how did we come up with the percentages? And really, in terms of the percentage, it wasn't, for me, it wasn't an exact percentage. I kind of drew out a good portion of the time I think about this. And we just happened to put this in a spreadsheet that allowed us to put 25% or 15%, or, how much of your day do you think about that, Jackie? How did you come up with some of that, your amount of space for each of those slices? What resonated with you that made one side bigger than another one?
Yeah, so as exactly like Renee with what you said, for the exact percentages, that typically when we do this activity, that it's not online, that we do it in person, that we draw it out on a board. And so we're not like, oh, 4.2 here. So this is definitely a little bit different, and to very well might not be exactly. We're just kind of thinking about, okay, in comparison to each other, how often do I think about my ability status versus how often do I think about these other identities? And so rather than focus on the exact percentages, just focus on how big you're making your pie chart. Don't feel like you have to put the exact percentages. Just focus on I'm trying to make my hands say what I mean. Just focus on the amount, like how big the individual pie slices are. Hopefully that's helpful. I should have blurred out those exact percentages. I didn't realize how much they would show up on there.
That's okay, but it's just kind of that if you don't think about it very much, then that slice is going to be pretty small. If it's something you think about, you get up in the morning and you go, oh my goodness, yes, I am a Black woman. It's something I think about. And even the times when I don't necessarily think about it, someone will remind me that I'm a Black woman by something that they say to me. And so that's why that slice for me is pretty big, because it winds up being something I wind up thinking about. So those are ways of thinking about your slices, so to speak. So it doesn't have to be exact, but just kind of an idea of what kind of resonates for you.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to bring back this identity chart, and then we're going to turn it to you. We're going to give you about 3 minutes. Renee, does that sound okay?
Yeah, we could go a little longer if we want, but
we want to do 4 minutes, and then we'll do a check-in at 3 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll give you until 7:42 to make your own pie chart, and we too will I'll set my timer right now just to make sure. And then, actually, let's do 7:43. And then I'll come back together at that point, and then we'll have some poll questions to check in and kind of gauge where the group is.
If we had permission, I feel like I would be doing the music, do, 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 but we might not have permission to use that music, so we won't. We don't want to get in trouble. So draw your pie chart. I hope you're coming along pretty well with this.
Okay, you have about 1 minute left. And if you have already finished your pie chart, then another step that you can take if you'd like is to go through and put a P or put a star, some sort of just notation on there for the identities in which you hold a fair amount of privilege. Just another step if you have a few extra minutes, and then we'll come back together in about 30 seconds to a minute.
And just remember, there are other identities that we don't have here on the chart. So education could be something, or language. There may be other identities that you hold that you would put in place of these. The reason we use these particular ones, like I said, the poll we're going to do in a few minutes only allowed us 10. So we kind of picked and chose one. So it doesn't mean that you couldn't have more slices or less slices of things that you would put down as a part of your identity.
Should we go ahead and go to the first poll question?
Sure.
Okay, so the first poll question is, which identities do you think about most in your day-to-day life? And as the poll question comes up, you're also welcome to choose as many identities as you would like, that it is set to, so you don't just have to choose one. We recognize that there might be multiple identities that really influence your day-to-day life. So lots of responses coming in. Thank you all. Okay. We have about 10 more seconds to finish the voting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Oh, perfect. Okay, so it looks like race and ethnicity is one that a lot of folks think about. So I also see that age is on a lot of people's minds, as well as body size. But then immigration status does not seem to really influence a lot of your day-to-day lives. And even though this is, subsection of the athletic trainers that are out there, to just think about in general, as you're seeing some of these responses come in, whether you think that this reflects your field at large as well, reflects your colleagues, to how it coincides with which identities you think about and which identities you don't think about. Should we go ahead and go to the next one, Renee? Is there anything you want to add on?
No, that's good. I just thought that was interesting with race and gender. And then religion, let's see, what was the third one? Was it, age and body size, I thought were interesting as well. And particularly given the range, my understanding, like I said, that we have people who are in high school all the way up to baby boomers. So we have quite a diverse range of people who are in this particular presentation. So I think that makes it really different in terms of where we see some of the answers. So thank you for that. So yes, let's go to the next question. So question number 2, which identities influence how you think others perceive you? So which of these identities do you think how others perceive you? Okay, got quite a few coming in. And we know that there's some of you who there's a class of people that may be watching, so we may only get one response from. So if there's a group of you who are watching, maybe take a quick poll around the group and then see who kind of has the majority, and maybe that's the answers that you give from your group. Okay. We had about 80% who voted this time around. So, so as you can see here, 63% had race, 61% had age. So again, I wonder on both ends of that spectrum, is it because, you know, for those who may be younger, high school age, those who may be more college aged, is that an issue? Those who may be young professionals, is that the issue there with age? Those who are, as I said, baby boomers or who've been in the field for greater than 20 years. So it'll be interesting after we finish and we have some question and answers towards the end, maybe some of you would be willing to share some of what that may have looked like for you. What else was high in this one? 40% we had body size, also in terms how others perceive you. And gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and class were similar to each other. Religion and spirituality was a little bit on the lower end. That may be in some cases because people may not know what your religion. You may not wear an amulet or, in my case, a cross or something that might identify that I happen to be Christian. So people may or may not know what your spirituality is. So maybe that might be one of the reasons why that was a little bit lower. Any other thoughts about this one, Jackie?
No, I just think that it's interesting too for both of them that race has been the highest. And I'd love to hear more context about it. It's weird being in the webinar format and not being able to get any thoughts and feedback. Maybe at the end, if we have some time, it would be like you said.
Yeah, that would be great.
Do we go to the next one?
Yes, let's see what the third one looks like.
So for the third question, we're looking at which identities give you power and privilege in society.
It's interesting watching the polling come in. You all can't see the polling coming in, but we can see that. So it's interesting to see how that's coming in.
Okay. A couple last people and then we'll go ahead and close it. Okay. So, I advanced too fast. So once again, it looks like race and ethnicity is among the highest, We also have class, we have ability. Ability is sort of high up there, but it looks like mostly race and ethnicity and class are the highest.
Mhm.
And two, with that, also just think about as well how this translates. That while, of course, this webinar is probably not entirely representative of the entirety of your profession, and just to think about how this might coincide with what you know about who is within the profession. Is the profession predominantly white? Is it to folks who are mostly maybe middle class or upper class when we're looking to at the class status? So just to be thinking about these poll results in conjunction to with the larger profession as a whole.
Mhm. Okay. And then question number 4, which identities give you power and privilege at work or maybe on campus? Again, we know we have students, so that's why we put on campus, and then we know we have professionals who are already in the field. So which of these identities give you privilege at work or on campus? And how does, well, let's see how that maybe differs from how society in general, maybe there's certain things that happen in the workplace that aren't happening or are happening in society in general. Okay, we'll give just a few more minutes. See if there are a few others. Looks like it seems to have stopped. So, now this one is the first one where we have ability. So what gives you privilege on campus? So ability. That's interesting. I would love to hear some comments or some questions when we get back to the question and answer towards the end of why ability giving you or giving individuals privilege on campus or at work different from in society. We saw race and ethnicity in society. So it'd be interesting to hear some of those comments. So please jot those down. I think that would be interesting to unpack a little bit. Race ethnicity was still high at 56%, and then age again at 47%. So it'd be interesting to unpack that a little bit and see what your thoughts are, or some comments and or some questions that you might have about that. So thank you for sharing with us to answer those questions. Again, this was just a little bit of opportunity to really think about how you identify who you are. Again, we didn't put in all the identities, and some of you have mentioned some other identities. Could be your education, it could be your health status, could be your language. There's certainly other identities that you would include in this list, and how you would define yourself. But understanding who you are, and then understanding how those identities might privilege you in certain spaces, but not privilege you in other spaces. And what does that mean as athletic trainers as we go into our workspaces and we're working with our patients? And are we privileged simply because we're the athletic trainer? What does that do, and how does that make it? Because we have knowledge as a healthcare provider, but how does our race or our gender or our class or our ability or our body size privilege us in the workplace with the people that we work with, or disempower us? That would be the other side of that question, where it may disempower us in some kind of way. And then what do we do when those things begin to intersect? And as it intersects with our colleagues, as it intersects with our patients, as it intersects with our bosses, and what does that mean and how does that impact you? Things to think a little bit about. So thank you for engaging us with this particular activity.
Okay, so now we're going to dive into some specific skills that you can use to engage across difference. And one of the first kind of just general primers that we want to give is to showing y'all this image. So what you'll see up there is an elephant, or at least what we're able to see as an elephant. That you'll see too around it are these people who are looking at just one little small segment of the elephant. So you'll see one person looking at the tail and saying it's a rope. And that is their only perspective on the greater elephant is just the tail, and they think that it's a rope. And then on the ear, or like up on top of the elephant, you'll see someone saying it's a fan, when really we see it too as an ear. Someone looking at the leg of the elephant and saying it's a tree, it's a spear, it's a snake. And that each of these people, that they have a very limited purview of this greater whole, the greater whole being the elephant. And that too, when you engage in dialogue, particularly to dialogue across difference, people who hold different identities, have different backgrounds and experiences, that's slowly but surely putting together more pieces into the larger whole. And so too, as we go forward with the remaining portions of this, just keep in mind to this image and be thinking about the ways in which maybe you've engaged in dialogue across difference before, and you've learned a little bit more about the world, had an aha moment, learn about something that you didn't previously know about before. So we also want to do a little bit of a preface of dialogue versus debate. And so to start out with thinking about debate, that with debate, the goal is to win. So I think about what for the longest time were at basically any conversation that I had with my dad. And we would get into hardcore debate. We'd be going at it. We would be trying to prove each other wrong. I would only be listening to him to try to figure out like what holes I could poke in his argument, and really to listening to find those flaws. And that really the goal of debate is to win. I wanted to come out of that situation having won. And to especially the best was when I would get my mom on my side, and my mom and I would team up against my dad, and we'd just be going at it. So that would be an example of debate, and we would all walk away just frustrated and angry and not feeling so good. Then kind of in contrast, we have dialogue, which with dialogue, the goal of dialogue is to grow. And we're assuming that many people have different answers and can find different solutions. It's collaborative. It's to really focused on listening to the other person, to really understand where they're coming from, understand their background, understand why they believe what they believe, and then ultimately to trying to learn more about the whole. And as I've shifted with my dad more into dialogue in recent years, I have found that too, our relationship has dramatically shifted as well, that we are way more attuned to listening to one another. We are way more respectful of each other when we do encounter differences. And that too, we're willing to kind of sit down and take a breath and listen to where the other person is coming from in a way that we were never doing when we were only engaging in debate. And I really too mean it that our relationship has gotten so much stronger since we have made that active shift into dialogue. And so when to engaging or trying to shift your conversations into dialogue, that it can be kind of hard at first, especially when you might not necessarily have some common language between the parties you're trying to engage in dialogue with. And so we wanted to provide you with some sample conversation guidelines that you can try to set forth at the beginning of the dialogue that you're engaging in. And I know too, it might seem kind of awkward and kind of weird, like you're in the middle of a debate and suddenly you say, pause, let's take a second, let's take a beat. We're gonna sit down and I really want to engage in this conversation with you. My relationship with you means a lot. And I think though, to really be able to get to the point where we're engaging in a meaningful dialogue where we're both listening to each other, we got to take a beat. We got to take a step back. We have to come up with some ground rules for what this is going to look like together. And so I found that when I've done that, as weird and as cheesy as it might seem, to like sit there and actually come up with what your ground rules are going to be, it can really, really help to produce some more fruitful conversations. And so the first one is to listen carefully with an open heart and an open mind, to speak from personal experience and respect that our experiences are different. And to also want to add to this with what Renee mentioned earlier of suspending disbelief. That if someone shares that they had an experience that differs greatly from your own experiences, to just take a step back and to try to really be there and believe the person and their experiences. Recognizing that it's okay to disagree, but to do so without blame or shame, to treat people with dignity, to honor confidences, to step up and step back. That one of, I think, the key signs that we're engaging in a debate is when we are talking way, way, way too much and we don't ever pause to really listen to the other person. And so remember to step up if you haven't been speaking very much, and step back to if you realize you've been talking a lot. Be aware of the difference between intent versus impact, which Renee had just talked about earlier, and also to, importantly, apologizing if you make a mistake. Allowing for all to grow, that we are all learning and unlearning some really, really harmful messages that we learned growing up, and to allow for both yourself as well as for the person or people who you're engaging in dialogue with to grow. Accept discomfort, and to view that as a learning opportunity, to remember the concentric circles that I showed at the beginning of our time together today, and to really lean into that learning edge space where it might be a little bit outside of your comfort zone to be learning about someone else's experiences, but to really be leaning into that space because that's where we're going to be growing. To expect non-closure, that the conversations that we're having with you today, that we could talk about nonstop for our entire lifetimes and still wouldn't get closure. And to the way that I kind of frame a successful workshop is when folks are walking away with more questions than they have answers, that you're learning that there's a lot about the world and a lot about other people's experiences and the perspectives that you might not have realized before, and that you want to learn more. You want to try to find some answers to those questions, and hopefully will bring up more answers to questions, or will hopefully bring up more questions. And so expecting non-closure, and then also to remembering that we're all co-learners. And so when you're sitting down, trying to engage with dialogue with someone, trying to engage in dialogue with someone for the first time, to really set forward that like we are all here learning together. That just because I know XYZ or I had XYZ experience doesn't mean that I'm not going to be learning from you. So that setting up the ground rule that everyone is going to be learning from each other. And these, of course, are just a few examples that you might come up with a lot more that you might need to be implementing those dialogic spaces, and I encourage you to do so as well. But we at least wanted to provide some sample ones for you to use if they're helpful.
So what do you do if, as you think about this, you're having a conversation and the colleague makes an insensitive comment during the discussion? How might you handle that? There are a lot of things. Sometimes there's what has been called fight, flight, or freeze, where you might be ready to take off and not engage in that conversation at all. Sometimes there's that freeze moment where you're like, okay, I can't believe they just said what they said, and I'm not sure what I should do about it. And sometimes you want to fight, and we hope that's less often than what you might want to do, but we understand that all of those can be the experiences that you have. Laura gives us at least one method of being able to have that conversation when it's appropriate to have the conversation. And the Laura method was developed by Love Makes a Family. And so this was some courtesy of nonviolent transformative response. And so when someone says something to you, it could be in a class, it could be a meeting, it's surprising, it doesn't match what your own perspective is, it might be insulting or offensive to you, or it could be just an awkward situation. The Laura method talks about listening, affirming, responding, and then adding. This is just one way that you might be able to have that conversation. And so L, so the first step is in listening. So it really is an active listening. What is the person literally saying? So as you engage in this conversation, what are they saying? Not what you think they're saying, but what are they actually saying? And how do you let empathy rather than anger guide you in your understanding of what lies beneath the words? And how do you also pay attention to body language? And that's both your body language. So if you're coming across, your arms are here and your face is all scrawled up and you're looking like you're ready to jump into a debate, as opposed to stepping back and having a dialogue about the issue, your body language, yours and theirs, can say a lot about what that person may be thinking or feeling, or how they're ready to engage or not ready to engage in the conversation. So, and Jackie's going to talk with you a little bit about some different ways of listening.
Okay, so today we too want to focus on two different levels of listening. The first being internal listening. And so internal listening is what I think a lot of us kind of revert to engaging in on a regular basis. So that's where we're more focused in on our internal voice. And we're thinking about our response to what the other person is saying to us, thinking about what am I going to say next? How can I add to the story? How can I too sometimes one up that person's story, make my story seem more exciting or more scary, whatever it is. So for example, with this, say that I'm talking to a friend, they just went to the grocery store and they saw a person who was not wearing a mask and they were really, really upset about that. And then rather than to saying, you know, I'm so sorry that you had that experience, I'm so sorry that they didn't respect your boundaries, that I would then jump in and say, oh my gosh, well, you wouldn't guess what happened. I went to the store and I saw 5 people who weren't wearing masks, and just really focusing too on me. And then just going back and forth with us, trying to share stories back and forth, but not actually fully listening to each other. On the other side, we have focused and active listening, and that's what we really want to challenge y'all to engage in when you are engaging in dialogue. And that's where the attention is focused on the person who's speaking, sharing their story, and that you're respectfully asking questions of them. You're trying to turn off your internal voice and not being concerned with your own opinion, but really just being there in the moment to listen to what the other person is saying. So that could look like, tell me more about that. That could look like even just simply saying, if someone shares something that's really hard, like, I am so sorry that you had to experience that, and just being with them there in the moment, not feeling like you need to kind of blabber on and fill the silence, but you just being with them in the moment, attention focused solely on the speaker. And two, because I found that when I'm really intent on engaging in that focused and active listening space, I'm able to have much more productive dialogue. So I'm really learning from the other person. I'm too in the headspace to be able to be challenged by what they're saying, to be able to think about how that might conflict or coincide with my own perspectives and beliefs, and to just be there in the space with the person in that moment.
Yeah, and I would add to that, that sometimes my sister and I, when we talk about this focused, active listening, we call that asking for tea and sympathy. Because sometimes we may be having a conversation and I am so ready to jump in and to help out and to respond to what she's saying, and I'm not really listening and focus, or the same thing could be she's not really listening and focusing to me. And one of us will say, okay, I need tea and sympathy. Okay, tea and sympathy means stop that internal voice going on, really focus, really listen, and hear what that person is saying to me. So I have even done this with some of my, a couple of my colleagues. It's like, no, I just need some tea and sympathy right now. And so then we're able to talk about and dialogue about certain things because they know what that means. Step 2 is to affirm. So this is being genuine and truthful in your affirmation as you listen to what the person may have to say. Now, you don't necessarily have to automatically agree with what the individual is saying. Sometimes we agree to disagree, but you certainly have to be truthful in what it is that you're saying to them. Paraphrasing what they said, making sure that, again, you heard what they heard, or you heard what they said based on their understanding of this and your understanding of it. So it's kind of that teach back. What did you say? I thought I heard you say this, and let me make sure I understand what you said. Expressing a connection between what the speaker said and what you heard. Again, making sure you weren't doing your own filtering, your own internal conversation, and so you heard something different than what the person was trying to actually express. And then expressing an appreciation and honesty and authenticity. Thank you for sharing. And sometimes it could be, again, we could agree to disagree on what it is that we're having conversations about. But if we can't have those conversations in an open way, how do we move ourselves forward and move beyond what the differences we may be having, or move through, maybe not beyond, moving through what those differences are that we're having. The third step in the Laura method is then to respond, and respond in an honest, respectful and thorough manner. As we've talked about debate, so it's avoiding debate. You're not trying to debate with someone, though we know that the other person might want to debate. So if they're continuing to try to debate with you, then maybe they're not ready for this conversation. Maybe this isn't the time to have the conversation until some ground rules can be set and we can come at this tough issue from a place of dialogue as opposed to a place of trying to debate it. Using I statements, again, owning your beliefs and your experiences. Sometimes we'll talk about they, this ubiquitous they, as opposed to saying, no, I believe, I think, I feel. Well, you know, when they think that or when they think this, it's like, who is they? When in fact, it is us. How do we own what our beliefs are and what our experiences are, as opposed to this, like I said, this ubiquitous type of they person out there in the stratosphere. And then number 4 is to add information. So sharing additional information with the speaker, and acknowledging that there can be some complexity to the issue that you're discussing, that you may not know all of the answers right now. You may not get to all of it right now, but how do you hopefully move forwards to have the dialogue? If you have additional information that you can share, if you know something about the particular thing that you're talking about, or if you have resources that you can provide for that or for that person, or ask them to provide additional information relative to their particular perspective, so that you can work through whatever the difference is that you may be having. So acknowledging that there can be complexity. And again, that complexity can be so much as, again, you know, fight, flight, and freeze, and determining if it's the right time to even have the conversation. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes you're better off to delay that conversation to a time when both people are in a place in a space that they're able to have it. So in summary with Laura, it is a tool that you can use to communicate across differences. And when used regularly, it can reframe the ability to engage in conflict empathetically in ways that hopefully invite diverse perspectives in an effort to try to create shared meaning. We know, just kind of like the example of the elephant, that there wasn't shared meaning initially. You know, someone saw a rope, someone saw that this was a snake, and someone thought this was a fan. But how do you move towards that bigger picture of shared meaning? And in today's climate, that can be tough sometimes. There may be individuals who don't want to get to a shared meaning. So understand that they may not want to, and you may not be able to have that conversation. But hopefully, you know, I'm certainly the optimist, and the glass is half full, that you can engage people, even if you disagree on some things, and come to the fact that you may agree to disagree, but hopefully have a better understanding of where someone's coming from. And this is one way that you can possibly do that.
Okay, and one last tool that we want to offer y'all, I believe it's our last one, is React, which is the strategy that we use for apologizing when we cause harm. And so first in this approach is to reflect, to really listen to what the person is saying, be focused and active and in the moment to what the person you harmed is saying to you. Acknowledge responsibility for your actions. I know that I caused harm. Apologize without explaining your intent. That I know we all mean good and we all mean well, that the intent when we hurt someone doesn't matter. If we step on someone's toes, it doesn't matter that we didn't mean to step on their toes. What actually happened was that we stepped on their toes and we really, really hurt them. And so to apply that as well to if you're engaging in dialogue across difference and you harm someone, you say something that's hurtful or to your actions are really harmful, that just apologize and own the fact that you caused harm. Change your behavior is ultimately the most important thing, that the person took the time to tell you what harm you caused, to make sure that you really change your behavior after the fact. And also you can share with them what you plan to do in the future as well. And finally, thank them for helping you learn. And this step 2 is so important because the person who explained what harm you caused to them, they didn't have to do that it takes a lot of emotional labor for someone to come forward and say, hey, you did XYZ and that was really hurtful to me. And so ultimately thank them for helping you learn and for helping you to realize what you did. And two, with this, we are all going to make mistakes, particularly too when interacting and working alongside people who hold different identities than we do. that we are all too socialized to believe some pretty harmful things. And as we're working to learn and unlearn and do better, inevitably we're going to be making mistakes. I know I have definitely made my fair share of mistakes and know that I will continue to unfortunately be making them. What is so important is that we are really reflecting on that and really to working to do better and to change for the future so that we're not repeating the mistakes that we've made.
And I would add to that, you know, being on the other side of the apology can be a difficult place to be. It can be uncomfortable. I'll give the example. This happened to me not too awful long ago. A friend of mine shared with me that I did something that hurt them with my actions. And so I had no idea that what I did was hurtful to them until that individual was brave enough, one, to tell me and trusted us enough in our relationship and wanted our relationship to continue. So they shared with me what was going on. And initially I wanted to go, but I didn't mean to hurt you. And it's like intent versus impact. Didn't matter that I didn't intend to hurt the individual because I didn't. You know, for a few of you that know me out there, it's like, oh no, oh my gosh, you know, pulled out the tissue box. I can't believe that I hurt my friend. And so it was hard to hear that. It was hard to hear that I hurt someone when I had no intention of doing so. But again, it wasn't about the intent. It was about the impact that it had on that individual. So I apologized profusely to that individual and said that I will work very hard not to do that again. Thank you for bringing it to my attention because I did not know. But now that I know, I can do better and not do that again. And if I do go down that path again, then you have permission to call me out. That's what I said to my friend. You get to call me out on that. And the conversation can be, can you call me out privately though? I'd rather not have that indicated in the midst of everything. Maybe we can have our signal. You know, you just said something or did something that wasn't real cool. But we get that opportunity. And then I did. I thanked the person and said, thank you for letting me know, because I would not have wanted our relationship to dissipate over this, because that person could have just disappeared and said, you know, you said that or you did this and I don't care anymore and I'm gone. And I would have had no idea why that relationship would have disintegrated. And in the workplace or in school, people may not be able to necessarily disappear away from you. And if you're in a superior position over someone, so you're a preceptor with students, you're a faculty member with students, you are the athletic trainer with your patients, that person who is in a more subordinate type of role may not come forward and tell you, but that patient may not ever show up again. And you're wondering what happened? Why is so-and-so not coming in to the athletic training facility or coming back to see me? Well, you did something that really ticked them off and they didn't feel comfortable enough to be able to share with you what happened. Or if they did share with you, and then you just kept trying to explain it away and explain it away and explain it away, rather than owning it and apologizing for it. So now the person has learned, oh, I can't come to that individual. I can't trust that they are really going to apologize and be sincere about it. So hopefully this is a way for you to think about if someone comes to you, or those moments when you open mouth and insert foot, and they do and will happen, that this is the way that you can apologize for that and try not to do harm again in the future. So hopefully these are things that will help you. And then lastly, you know, who we are, our identity, as we've talked about today, the different ways in which we define ourselves, how we are perceived, how our identities are perceived, and then how we ultimately communicate with other people. All of those things, like I said, affect our communication. So we hope that tonight you learned a little bit more about who you are, thinking a little bit about who you are, how you define yourself, and maybe how others define you can impact your ability to practice in a culturally competent kind of way. And hopefully a couple of tools to think about what you might be able to use if you're having conversations across difference. And if in the a situation where you happen to open mouth and insert foot, or your intent was not to step on their toe, but you broke a toe nonetheless when you stepped on it, how do you hopefully have conversations that help you to apologize? So we hope you learned a few things with us this evening. And now we can open up for some questions and some comments. As we do that, I would like to say thank you all for joining us. We look forward to having some question and answers, and we've got time for that. And a special shout out to my colleagues at MSU Athletic Training Family, where I did my doctorate work. So we thank you for hosting us. It's been a pleasure. So what questions do you have for us?
Oh, Tracy, I can't hear you.
Nope, can't hear you, Tracy.
Okay, well, while Tracy's doing tech support, I can jump in and get us started with some questions, and then she can pop back in when she's ready. So we do have some questions that were sort of specific to different points in the presentation. So I'm just going to start from maybe the earlier things, and then we can progress forward from there. One question we got was something we deal with regularly in athletic training is, patients who have a short-term change in their medical or health status. So it may not be sort of the same as having a disability that you've had your entire life or that you identify with in a certain way. And so how do you sort of, in the pie chart exercise, sort of weigh short-term issues that may arise, like an injury? And then how do you, advise that clinicians might work with someone who's had a recent change in their privilege or in their sort of identity relative to something like that?
I can start with that. Yeah, some of our identities, of course, stay the same. I'm Black, I'm going to always be Black, and that's not changing anytime soon, other than the way the government might define it. But as you said, with the short-term medical, it's important to ask your patients what's important to them at that time. Is this short-term disability, such as the injury, important to their life or how it's impacting their life? So asking your patients about what things and ways and things that they're thinking about are impacting them, and how are they impacting them? So if wearing a knee brace is going to impact their ability to do their job, and it's only going to affect them for a short while because they're wearing a knee brace for 4 weeks, then you've got to then think about asking them, do they have stairs at home? Which we should ask these things anyway, but it really becomes important. Do they have stairs? Is it going to be difficulty getting into and out of the car? Is it their driving leg? So all of a sudden, someone who was able-bodied now has a temporary disability that's impacting their life. And it's important to find out, how is it impacting their life, and have they thought about how it's impacting their life? And in that way, you can begin to help them navigate what some of those issues are. On college campuses, in our case, if students have a temporary disability, they hurt themselves, we can also use disability services. That's the beauty of working on a college campus, and say, I got a student now all of a sudden who has a temporary disability. What are the issues that we can utilize to help them to negotiate that? You might also have that on a high school campus. There may be individuals who can help you if a student has a temporary disability, and then how do you help them to negotiate what they need to do at school as well? Hopefully that helped. Jackie, any other comments about that?
No, I think that you just about covered it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks. Hopefully that answered your question. Others?
I think that was great. So another question that rolled in was, so outside of age as a potential way that you identify, is it common to see that your sort of evaluation of some of your identities change as you move through the lifespan, or sort of grow and develop? Or do most people have relatively stable identities over time? And then also, does privilege status sort of change over the lifespan, or is that something that tends to be considered relatively stable, as people age?
That's a good
start with that?
Yeah, sure. So, I think there are definitely some identities that can change and can shift over time. And also the salience that someone has related to their identity can definitely change over time. So for example, for my disability status, I wasn't diagnosed with my disabilities until I was 16. And so at that point, I knew that I had some challenges, but it wasn't until I was 16 that finally it became kind of this aha moment for me of like, okay, like I'm disabled. And then it took me even longer until it was just kind of like there as a part of my identity. Like I knew that it was there. I knew that it impacted some parts of my life, but it too really took some time for me to develop kind of that consciousness around how being disabled plays into the rest of my identity and plays into my day-to-day life, into what having a disability identity even really meant to me. And I also too think the same around my Jewish identity, and that being Jewish, it really shifts and changes depending on the context that I'm in. And well, I mean, I think across the board that being Jewish does not afford one privilege, that in certain spaces and in certain locations that it's a little bit easier to be Jewish. So when I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and in St. Louis, particularly to where I lived, that there were a lot of Jews. Synagogues everywhere. While we didn't get off for the high holidays, that for the most part, professors were really, really understanding. There were kosher restaurants. We were able, to get by a little bit more. And then I moved to Des Moines, Iowa for my undergraduate institution. And wow, I was, for some people, the very first Jew that they had ever met. My professors did not understand Jewish holidays. It was really hard to get off sometimes from class for the Jewish holidays. And so too, it really kind of differed and changed just depending on the context that I was in and who else was around me. Those are just two of kind of my own anecdotal experiences, but I would say that into it just also depends on identity to identity, that some can change, or like Renee mentioned, that race is going to be stagnant throughout your whole life. Renee, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I would. And it's the setting. There's some of your identities that you have to purposely share with individuals, so that they know that particular identity is there. And sometimes once they know the identity, then you get treated differently. I found some research that I did with women athletic trainers who looked ethnic. So for example, if the woman was indigenous and she, quote, looked stereotypically indigenous, she had dark hair, dark eyes, high cheekbones, a little bit browner skin or reddish undertones, and looked like she was Native American Indian, then she was treated that way. But if the person, in fact, I just did a presentation 2 days ago, a young lady identified as being indigenous, had blonde hair and blue eyes. So she appears to be white. And so people treat her with white skin privilege. And so unless she tells someone that she is of a particular American Indian tribe, people don't know. And then once she tells them, it's like, oh, so you're that. And then they start treating her as this indigenous identity. And so there is some fluidity that can happen based on not only how you identify yourself, but as I talked about earlier, how people perceive you. And you can be both privileged and disempowered based on your relationship to others and others' perceptions of you. So yes, that can change and be fluid, and can change over time in terms of what's important. Age, again, like I had mentioned earlier, now that I'm getting AARP, well, I think about age a little bit differently than when I was in my 20s versus when I was in my 40s. And so that's something that has become more salient at different parts in my life than they are at other parts of my life. So no, your identities can shift in the situation that you're in and what you choose to share about your identity, and how then people interact with you based on what you shared with them or what they perceive you to be.
How can we avoid putting people in boxes? And how can we avoid certain thinking or be mindful of this pitfall?
I'm just jotting down a couple of notes that come to mind. So Renee, if you have an answer, go for it.
Okay, yeah. That's hard to do, because when we meet people, we're usually trying to figure out a way that we can connect with them. And we often then start with what we see. So we may be defining them as woman, defining them as Black, defining them as being in a partnered relationship of some sort based on the things that we do. So it's about sometimes asking individuals and not assuming. And then as it relates to our patients, asking them, are those identities important? Just because I have a certain identity doesn't mean it's important to my patient practitioner interaction. It's about asking if those things are important. So it can be difficult to do that, to not put people in boxes, because that's where we want to go, because we're trying to find a way to connect. But it's about having that conversation and asking.
Yeah, I leave it with that. That's beautiful.
Okay.
Is bias so ingrained that even if everyone were the same in the world, would we find a way to divide?
Jackie, you want to take a stab at that one? If not,
I can try. I mean, just thinking about that, and we don't necessarily even know if everyone were to be the same in the world, because everyone is so different, that we have so many different backgrounds and identities and beliefs. And so I'm also just kind of struggling to think about like how we would even gauge what would happen in that scenario if everyone were to be the exact same. But I would say that, I mean, yeah, bias is very, very, very ingrained in us. From such a young age, we are learning about different stereotypes. We're learning to believe certain things about certain groups of people, whether it's from the media, whether it's from our families, whether it's from our places of worship, from TV, it's you name it, that we are learning so many different messages, a lot of them really, really harmful messages about different groups. And so I would definitely say that those messages are really, really, really ingrained. And then implicit biases, whether we want to have implicit biases or we don't want to have implicit biases, that inevitably every single one of us are going to have those biases just because of the world that we're socialized in. But what is the most important though is that we're working to counter those biases, working to name them when we have them, working to not act upon those biases, and trying to do better.
yeah, that's one of those theoretical questions. It's almost what came first, the chicken or the egg. If everyone were the same, then maybe the person who has long hair gets treated one way versus the one with the short hair, or the one with the blue eyes gets treated differently than the one with the brown eyes. In different cultures around the world, we might look at that particular group in another part of the world and say, really, how is it that you all were fighting each other when if I look at you, you all look like the same group of people? But they have found some way, whether it's through economics to make a difference, whether it's a clan, or whether it's religious difference. So I don't know, we find a way to bias. I don't know. And if we think about biases as ways of privileging one group over another, as ways of having power in some ways. And in some communities, it wasn't just about power, but land meant power. So how do I take your land? And if I have more land, sometimes it was, we might be all the same people, but I happen to live near the water and you want water rights and you can't have them. So you've got to go through me to get the water rights. And so unfortunately, in the world, there have been different ways than even when it appears that people are very similar, particularly if we're not familiar with that cultural group. There have been ways of determining a difference and determining a power structure in some way, and determining who has access to what resources that might be available. So yeah, I think it is ingrained, but I think we can improve it. I think we can work to make it better.
In regards to athletic training, have you seen any bias in treatment for patients based on their identity? And how would we combat that?
In athletic training, based on their identity, yes. I have seen, particularly since I've been in the profession for over 30 years, I've seen a time when women athletes did not receive the same access to resources as the male athletes did. So there was gender bias that was happening early on, and even still to some degree. It is difficult for athletes to come out of the closet. We're seeing a little bit more of it happening, but particularly in those sports where you're perceived to be masculine sports, so particularly football. So gay men trying to come out in football, and let's take it all the way up to the NFL, is extremely difficult and would be treated very badly. And there are examples of that, of athletes who have come out and been treated badly because of their sexual identity. And so, yeah, so there are those opportunities. When we don't know what to do with our patients who are trans and how to take care of them because we've not done our part as athletic trainers to know how to take care of them, then we could be giving inappropriate care to patients in some kind of way based on their gender identity or their sexuality. So yeah, there are those examples, just as in the world where we see these biases, they come into athletic training in the same ways. Sometimes the way athletes treat each other based on race or class or gender or sexuality or religion, you name it, that comes in as well. And what do we do about that? Part of it is understanding and recognizing that it's happening, and then trying to have that the athletic training room is a neutral place, that these things don't happen, and making it clear that everybody is welcome in our athletic training facilities. And so if you see something happening, if somebody's using inappropriate slurs, so whether they're racial slurs or against a gender, or they're against a sexuality or a gender identity, that you stop that and let it be known that this doesn't take place in your facility. We don't expect that to take place in our doctor's offices, our dentist offices, our psychology office. Why should we let that type of behavior take place in an athletic training facility? If we don't treat our facilities as medical facilities, how can we expect other people to treat our facilities as medical facilities? And if we don't have respect for ourselves as healthcare providers and the spaces that we're in and treat them as such, and so that any of our patients are welcome into those spaces, then how can we ask the medical community to treat us appropriately as healthcare providers as well when we're trying to ask for that space? So we shouldn't allow those things to take place. And just because the athletic training room or athletic training facility is attached to the locker room doesn't mean that what happens in the locker room should come over and happen in an athletic training facility. As far as I'm concerned, they crossed the line when they stepped into the athletic training facility, and that doesn't happen in our workspaces and shouldn't happen in our workspaces. And so we need to have safe spaces in our athletic training facilities. You can tell I'm a little passionate about that.
Yes. What policies or practices within athletic training would you recommend to help with cultural competency outside of what was discussed in this talk? And the state of Michigan has mentioned implicit bias training as potential area for continuing to learn in cultural competency. Would you like to see implicit bias training throughout the athletic training profession?
I'm just jotting some of that down. Absolutely. Not only implicit, bias training, I think we need safe training, safe zone training, and ally training for our LGBTQ colleagues and patients, so that we have a better understanding of what those issues are. I'm learning much more about the dialogues programs, and Jackie can talk a little bit more about that. So that how do we have those conversations? We're seeing dialogue programs come about on college campuses, but what does that look like in healthcare? How do we take that program? And Jackie, maybe you can speak a little bit more about what you do as a part of the dialogue training.
Yeah, definitely. So what intergroup dialogue is it's looking at this ongoing sustained dialogue that a group is having. And so within our dialogues programs, they meet over the course of a semester, and together they really build trust with each other, and they dive into topics just depending on the group. But we are actually looking at hopefully starting maybe some dialogues that are focused on healthcare specifically in the future. Within those dialogues, they're hoping that they'll be able to really dive into what medical racism looks like. How can they try to work against medical racism? How can they be more aware too of their own biases within their medical practice? And it just really stresses within the dialogues programs, we stress too that it's not a one and done type of experience, that this is just one point on their ongoing lifelong learning and unlearning journey, and that they get that semester to be able to learn with and from each other. And then to go on and to continue answering or continue to trying to find answers to all of the questions that they develop over the course of the semester. And so too, within the dialogue programs, it really focuses a lot on one, establishing those like basic listening skills and working to put those to practice in every single dialogue that they come to, working to engage in dialogue rather than debate, to using language that is welcoming and inclusive for folks, and then to really putting to practice those skills specifically when talking about race or when talking about gender. And so too, if you're looking for complements to cultural competency training, looking into maybe bringing intergroup dialogue into your place of work, trying to do that with your coworkers. And two, it can even just start as like at a staff meeting, everyone reads an article and you just commit every single staff meeting to reading an article, to engaging in dialogue about it together, and to flexing those dialogue skills while also learning with and from one another. So there are lots of different ways to that kind of continuous education can take shape.
Yeah, and I think that, the training, whether it's defined as cultural competence, implicit bias, ally safe training, should be more ingrained into our educational system for athletic training at Central Michigan. Our students take a 3 credit hour course, and as we transition to the entry-level masters, our students will take at least 6 credit hours in issues associated with cultural competencies, as well as these issues being taught across the curriculum as well. And then as you learn the basis of those skills, as a part of our programs, then how do you do continuing education? Because we're not going to learn it in a 2-hour workshop. You're not going to learn it, in just one session. It's not enough, because so much as the person said about being ingrained, we have to unlearn a whole lot of stuff that we have been taught, that all of us have been taught, those who've come through the United States public education system have been taught, and how do we unlearn those things? And it took us, over 50 years to learn those things, and it's going to take a while to unlearn some of those things. So yes, I think that we should include each of these types of trainings as a part of our athletic training education, as part of our continuing education, and not just the one and done. One and done is not going to get it. That checks a box. Yep, had the training, done with that, and having no opportunity to put it into practice and try to have those conversations where you can make a mistake and then learn from that mistake in a safe environment. So I think that becomes important.
How do you go about initiating a conversation with a colleague who may always say microaggressions towards people of your race?
That can be tough. I had a situation, this one wasn't a race issue with microaggressions. It was a microaggression, but it was geared towards the LGBTQ community, that somebody was using certain phrases in my space. And I pulled the person aside and went to their office and said, when you say that, this is what that means to me, and this is what it makes me think, and this is how it makes me feel, and I'm asking you not to say those kinds of things in my presence. Was it hard to say that? You betcha. It was hard to say that. But bringing it to the person's attention, doing it in a safe space, and indicating why this is important. And again, some people are going to be responsive to that, and they're going to want a dialogue about why that is, why that's the case. Others may not. Sometimes you can provide them with an article. Sometimes you can provide them with some information and say that might be a little safer way to do it, because in today's world, safety is important, as you would address and talk to people about different things. So maybe it's providing an article about that information. Jackie?
Yeah, and I also just wanted to add that for fellow white folks out there, that if you hear a white colleague continuously or even once putting forth a racial microaggression, that also you can pull that colleague aside too, and that I think we all need to start feeling this responsibility to use the Lara method, for example, like Renee shared, to interrupt oppression, to interrupt those microaggressions, and to all take responsibility for creating workplaces, and also outside of workplaces as well, that are really welcoming and inclusive and affirming of everyone's identities.
And I think it goes back to, how to have that as a part of a dialogue and not a debate, so that you're not accusing the person. If it's a situation, if you're talking about a microaggression and that person who was doing the microaggression happened to be white, if this is racial issue. I don't know if you've read the book or familiar with the book White Fragility. Really good book by D'Angela, I think it's her last name. Really good book that looks at why it's difficult for white people to talk about race. And I think that's can be helpful both for white people as well as for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to understand what you might be seeing as well, and how you might respond to some of those kinds of things. So I think it's about having that dialogue that says understanding that when you did this or when you said this, this could be hurtful. There's some great YouTube videos that I've seen that give a nice little example of what a microaggression looks like. And this one I saw had a person getting stung by a bee. And that's when it happened one time, but when it happens 10 times, what microaggression looks like. So sometimes using, in a sense, humor can be a way that can break the ice to show somebody what that might look like as well. So, trying different tactics that might be helpful to do that. So.
Because identity is not fixed, it is fluid within us all and in most of our patients and students. I'm a fan of the idea of cultural humility and not competence. Given the challenges with competence in defining it, measuring it, reachable, and the idea of Goodhart's law, humility implies unknowing and fluid, open to change, and an ever complete knowledge of something. What are your thoughts on using cultural humility over cultural competence in our attempts to educate and implement a different way of thinking, seeing, and being in the world?
Mhm. There are a number of different issues just as were raised as a part of that with regard to cultural competence and moving towards cultural humility. That's, I won't say relatively new, but it's been changing within the last several years of moving away from this idea of being competent. Kapina Bakote, whose model I talked about, has since added humility to her model, and she calls it cultural humility. I can't even pronounce it. She's put like culture and humility together as a word and as a phrase, and not just being competent. But in her model, she talks about that it's something that you're moving towards, that you never actually get it or hit it, so to speak. It's always something, it's a journey, not a destination. And so I do like the phrasing of cultural humility. I'm learning much more about it. And I'm sure I'll probably be using that more often than this notion of cultural competence. So I like the direction that scholars are moving in as they're beginning to talk more about cultural humility as opposed to just trying to be, quote, competent. So thank you for that comment, whoever wrote that.
What are some approach strategies for engaging with someone to learn more about their identities without making them feel alienated?
So I have a couple of initial thoughts. One is to just building up rapport with the person ahead of time. That it's like the first time that you meet someone, diving in to saying, oh, well, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Tell me all about your culture. And like to just peppering them with question after question after question after question. It's kind of all about the approach. And to learning, why do you really want to know that information as well? That it's because you want to build up your relationship with them and you really want to respect them, whether it's as your patient or as a friend, as a colleague, that it's just really important to build up that trust and that rapport first before you ask someone to share what can sometimes be a really personal part of their life. That's just one initial thought that I have, in addition to the way that you're asking the questions, to ask them in a respectful way, to, of course, if they don't want to answer it, or if they only answer shortly, to not try to pry more, but to just give them the space to be able to answer whatever questions you have if you do ask them, without trying to dig deeper if they're not reciprocating.
Yeah, and understand that not everybody wants to share all of their their identities with you if they don't have a trusting relationship and know that you're not going to use that information to harm them in some kind of way. So I think part of the issue is, why do you want to know it? If it's in the patient-practitioner relationship that you need to know, I think a lot of that information can be gathered, again, through the pre-participation physical exam or the paperwork that comes in that addresses, what is your race, what is your ethnicity, what is your, do you have disabilities or issues that we need to deal with? And you're asking those in the context of, how can I treat you most appropriately? And understanding, I'm asking these questions so that I can treat you appropriately. And then the other piece of that is giving the why. Why do you want to know it? And then I think one other piece of that is this salient for my visit to see you? So if I'm coming to you because I have a sore throat, you don't automatically need to know that I'm trans. You just need to know that I have a sore throat. My gender identity does not matter, or how I choose to identify myself or my sexual partner may not matter for my sore throat. So it's about making sure that you're asking for information that's appropriate to the patient encounter as well. Because for individuals who've been minoritized, sometimes they have been traumatized by sharing parts of their identity with their healthcare providers, and so may not trust you to use that information that's in a way that's going to help them, but may wind up using that information in a way that's going to harm them. So you have to establish that trust and help people to understand why you're asking that question.
Oh,
How do you address possibly always offending someone versus actually taking a stand for what you personally believe in? For example, I have colleagues who were offended because I actively supported Black Lives Matter. Their rationale was because of the link to defund the police, family linked to police roles. But I support Black Lives Matters and the political initiatives associated with it.
Sometimes we have to agree to disagree. There are going to be times when, you have conversations with colleagues that you agree to disagree. But the other piece of that is, can you have a dialogue about it? Is the person that you're talking to willing to dialogue versus debate, so that you understand their perspective and why they're offended by it? What is it about it that makes it offensive? And hopefully they're willing to learn why you support it. And at the end of that, you still might be on opposite or different sides of that conversation, but hopefully you at least respect each other for having those different opinions and agree to disagree about it. Jackie, you looking quick? Did you want to add something to that as well?
I was nodding in agreement. And yes, to really emphasizing that dialogue portion of just being there to hear each other out, to share your different experiences, and to believe strong in Black Lives Matter, and to don't waver from that, because really that stance should not be political, that Black Lives Matter, that Black lives do matter. And the fact that it is politicized just sometimes makes me really frustrated. Because you should just be able to say Black Lives Matter. And then too, as you're getting into the details, especially with looking at all of the push to defund the police, that too, maybe really sharing different articles. I think Renee's mentioned a couple times the importance of just like sharing articles and sharing different perspectives. And there have been so many great, whether it be news articles or blog posts or interviews from this past summer, to really explaining why why the movement for Black lives, as well as to a lot of the other protests that have been going on, and the different activism has been calling for defunding the police. So to pull from those other resources, and even if you don't have access directly to have someone share that perspective, that lots of those videos or articles can also kind of do the same, to incorporate in those perspectives that you might not necessarily have present within your physical space.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to understand where other people are coming from. Understand how people who think differently than you think. You don't necessarily have to agree with their particular perspective, but sometimes having a better understanding of that perspective helps you to become clearer about your own perspective with regard to that. And like I said, so, your colleague may never agree and may always feel offended by your support of Black Lives Matter. We can't always change other people. We can only change ourselves and our response to other people. So it's how you choose to respond about that. And can we still find a way to work together as colleagues? Can we find a way to respect each other and respect that we have a different opinion given this particular issue? And hope that we can work collegially and respectfully and with some grace with one another. And, how do you set the boundaries? And if that becomes a hotbed, do you set boundaries? Guess what? We disagree on this, and we may have to set some boundaries about what we can talk about relative to this while we're in our workspace and environment, so that we can all do our jobs for which we've been paid. So sometimes it may get to that particular point and you decide, we can't talk about that. Thank you very much, but we can't talk about that. So those are things to think about too.
Mhm.
As a newly certified female athletic trainer working in a football setting, it has been difficult to get male counterparts, male athletes, and male coaches to listen to my medical knowledge, suggestions, and policies, even though they are cited with NATA and Journals of Sports Medicine articles. As a woman in athletic training, how long did it take to gain the respect of men around the profession?
As a whole profession, I think there are those of us who are still trying to fight for those for that respect, and some of that's embedded in gender and difference in terms of gender identities for men versus women, males versus females, and then women in predominantly male roles and in predominantly male professions. And so I think our fight in that regard is not necessarily different than other women who are hitting the glass ceiling and have to deal with male patriarchy in their environments. And that's what it is. It's male patriarchy, that says men are in this group and women should not be in this group and should not be here. And so we don't have to listen to you. And so it's important, as we always like to say in athletic training, you got to know your stuff. And you have to be able to back up what you're doing and remember why you're there. You're there to take care of your patients. In this case, they're your athletes, and with regard to their health care. And you want to make sure that you're doing what you need to do so that you don't get sued. Well, you can always be sued, but if they sue you, that you're going to come out on the winning side because you took care of business like you needed to. And it can be difficult to win over the coaches. Been there, done that. I was a head athletic trainer with football as a part of my career, and had a coach who was interesting, to say the least. I outlasted him. What can I say? I did my job and did it well. And we went toe to toe and not quite nose to nose because he was a whole lot taller than me. But yeah, I had to stand tough in my decisions with regard to how I was treating my patients. And I remembered every day, I am here to take care of my patients. I am not here to please the coach. I am here to take care of my patients. And if I was going to get fired for that, then that's not a place I needed to work. If I'm not able to do the job that I need to do, then it's time for me to think about being somewhere else. So I don't know, Jackie, if you had some other types of experiences as it relates to gender dynamics and that type of thing.
I think you answered, especially the question from your experience within the athletic training sphere. I guess one thing just to add from, just maybe to speaking to, especially the cisgender men within this space, as well as to, for any of your privileges, that it's fine and great if we say, I want to be inclusive, I want to be welcoming of everyone, I really respect everyone's perspectives and opinions, but it's to a whole other thing to really try to be conscious of our biases and to make sure that we are actually enacting those espoused values on a day-to-day basis. And so to just be thinking about when, say, for example, for the cisgender men in this space, as you're interacting with your colleagues who are women, to be conscious of, are you really truly listening to what they're saying? Are you really valuing their perspective and to what they know should be done within the space? So just another reminder to be checking our biases.
And I would add to that piece, as you were talking, Jackie, about checking the bias, but I think the other piece can be, how do those men who are cisgender use their privilege in order to assist women in those situations? Because sometimes, that male athletic trainer can say to that male coach certain things about what needs to be taking place in terms of respecting women in the workplace. And so sometimes in that case, men can become allies or should become allies. And how can they use their gender privilege in order to be an ally in a situation where a female colleague may be treated inappropriately or not listened to or not respected? How can that person become an ally for their colleagues? And I think that's something to think about. That's that space of advocacy when we can use our privilege to advocate for those who may not have the same privileges that we do in certain spaces. And then I would also suggest, finding your allies. Is something going on in that space that's illegal? Are there places that you need to go to on campus to get support? So your Office of Civil Rights, Human Resources, up the chain, the athletic director, assistant or associate athletic directors. So those are things to think about too, and whether or not you need to find out if what's taking place is inappropriate. Your team physician, do you have support of your team physician to do the things that you're doing in the space that you're working in? How do you have those conversations? That was one thing that did work for me. My team physician and I had a great relationship, and I had a conversation that said, I can't be undermined every day at work, and we wait until, quote, the doctor gets here on Saturday when we've made a decision on Wednesday to hold somebody out. And my team physician, who happened to be male, said, you're absolutely right. So that also helped support me in the decisions that I was making every day.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but hopefully, Renee and Jackie, you would be willing for our attendees to send you some questions if they still have questions via email?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Okay. Well, I'd just like to thank, on behalf of Michigan State University's Athletic Training Lecture Series, we'd like to thank you for the wonderful presentation. To all the participants, we will be emailing you a link to an evaluation survey. And then for those of you, we will also be emailing you your CEUs for statement of credit for the 2 CEUs for this. But again, thank you so much for your wonderful talk, both to Renee and Jackie. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Michigan State, for sponsoring this. Jackie, it was a pleasure.
It's Renee. It was a pleasure as well. And thank you, Tracy, for hosting this.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Take care.